Tehran, the Paris of the Middle East. At least that's what it was known as back in the day. In 2025, it's known for something else entirely. Infrastructure so overwhelmed that the government had to declare a public holiday just to stop people from using water. The power grid fails so often that most avoid elevators entirely, as they have all too often become death traps in extended blackouts. In the air, when schools are closed for pollution days instead of snow days, you know that something has gone oh so terribly wrong. So what happened? How did a city compared to the French capital that was known for hosting Hollywood celebrities, international film festivals, and oil money pouring in so fast they couldn't spend it quickly enough, turn into the polar opposite of that? Well, this is that story. For most of Persian history, Tehran barely existed. Unlike the cities that were the centers of empire, the seats of power, Tehran was for much of this time period little more than a village in the shadow of Ray, which itself had been the capital of the Seljuk Empire in the 11th century. Even as late as 1786, when Aga Muhammad Khan of the Qajar dynasty moved the capital of his country to Tehran, it was still largely a rural backwater compared to Persia's glorious urban centers. But that decision changed the city's fate permanently. The choice was a strategic one. Tehran sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, protected by mountains yet accessible enough for commerce. Within a decade, Tehran's population tripled, surging to about 50,000 by the dawn of the 1800s, as people of all trades and professions flocked to the new capital. Construction transformed the city, and fast. By the time new walls with 12 different ornate gates went up around the city in the mid-19th century, it would have been largely unrecognizable to anyone living there previously. Yet all of this still paled in comparison to what would come under Reza Pahlavi, who led a military coup in 1921 and crowned himself Shah 4 years later. He was a man obsessed with modernity, determined to bring his country into the 20th century, whether that meant leading it there or dragging it. He wasted little time in centralizing power ruthlessly and became infamous for not exactly being the most patient person with his opposition. Within a few years, he determined that the current city would not do. It had to be rebuilt, with entire parts of the city said to be demolished and rebuilt. In particular, the old mud walls and ancient city gates that had defined Tehran for centuries were completely demolished. In their place rose broad boulevards inspired by Haussmann's Paris, modern government buildings, royal palaces. The University of Tehran opened in 1934, part of an ongoing drive to expand access to modern education in a city long dominated by religious institutions. The Trans-Iranian Railway finally connected the capital to both the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea, turning Tehran from an isolated mountain city into the beating heart of a modernizing nation. This redefined urban planning into something more akin to an urban revolution. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah, presided over what is now looked back on as Tehran's golden age, or at least for those who were on the right side of the government at the time, and only after one military coup in the 50s. That's a story for another channel another day. The oil boom of the 60s and 70s was like injecting rocket fuel into Tehran's veins. Oil revenues increased from $34 million in 1954 to $20 billion 2 decades later. The Shah poured much of this wealth into his capital, and the speed of change was hard for men to keep up with. The city's population exploded from 1.5 million in 1956 to triple that in 1976, faster growth than almost any city in history. Photos of the city from the late 60s and 70s make it look as though you could be in Paris or New York, people driving modern cars, wearing Western clothing. The Tehran International Film Festival brought Hollywood to the country, with Western stars like Elizabeth Taylor even walking red carpets. French boutiques lined Pahlavi Avenue, the Tehran Symphony Orchestra filled concert halls with Beethoven, and Iranian films started winning awards internationally. But for all this, the glittering transformation had been built on a foundation of fear. While the elite partied in North Tehran villas, the dreaded Savak secret police were torturing dissidents in Evin prison's basement chambers, a place so brutal it deserves its own episode, and we've actually done it already, so check it out after this. By the late 1970s, Tehran was a city at war with itself. The Shah had created a capital that looked modern but felt alien to many of its inhabitants, imposed from above, disconnected from Persian identity, maintained through force. When Tehran University students began leading massive protests, Marxists and Islamists finding common cause despite their opposing ideologies, they tapped into rage that had been building for years. Bazaar merchants resented foreign competition, religious conservatives despised the Western excess, intellectuals chafed under censorship, and workers watched oil wealth flow to everyone but them. Revolution was coming, and when it arrived, it would transform Tehran more completely than either Shah ever had. In January 1979, the Shah fled the country, clutching a handful of Iranian soil as he climbed into his plane at Mehrabad Airport. 2 weeks later, on February the 1st, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to the country after 14 years of exile to nothing short of a rapturous welcome. 3 million people lined the streets from the airport to Beshet-e Cemetery. Within days, Tehran underwent a cultural transformation as profound as anything seen during the Shahs, but in a fraction of the time. The changes came in waves, each more wide-reaching than the last. The hijab went from being virtually banned across the city to mandatory virtually overnight. Women who had been wearing miniskirts on Monday were wrapping themselves in chadors by Friday. Nightclubs that had hosted international DJs were padlocked and converted into Revolutionary Guard checkpoints. Alcohol sales were first made illegal, which was immediately extended to criminalizing possession of the substance, resulting in restaurants and shops pouring thousands of bottles of the stuff down the drain. The speed of change was breathtaking. One foreigner in the country recalled, "Within weeks, we would all be leaving. The party was over." By November, the international schools had largely closed. Foreign embassies were evacuating staff, a factor not helped by the storming of the US embassy and the kidnapping of its diplomats. And the Tehran that had existed just months before was already becoming a memory. This isn't just a story about a city that became more conservative under religious rule, though. Tehran developed something of a split personality that would come to define it for decades to come. As journalist Ramita Navai put it, in Iran, you live 2 different lives. There's an inside, private life, and an outside, public life. And that filters through to every single aspect of people's lives. In order to live in Tehran, you have to lie. An entire society learned to maintain parallel existences. Behind closed doors in North Tehran apartments, parties continued with smuggled alcohol and banned music, though increasingly under threat of being raided by the police. Satellite dishes, though illegal, sprouted on rooftops in increasing numbers in order to beam international media into their homes after the regime censored much of the domestic landscape. Dating had to be forced underground, with young couples meeting in parks and cafes, always watching for the morality police. The revolutionary government, which was isolated and starved of assets, nationalized banks, industries, and large businesses, seizing billions in assets from Tehran's elite families who were all seen as being loyal to the deposed Shah. Property values in North Tehran collapsed as wealth fled the country. Villas that had hosted champagne parties became Revolutionary Committee headquarters or stood empty, their pools drained. The Tehran Stock Exchange essentially ceased to function, and foreign investment completely evaporated. The brain drain as a result of this was something that would cripple the country. Doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and anyone with foreign connections or the means to do so got out of the country. Within just 2 years, an estimated 180,000 educated Iranians had fled. By some count, Iran lost more university graduates in 1979 to 1980 than it had produced in the previous decade. The revolution had promised justice and prosperity. It delivered neither. If that wasn't exactly getting off on the right foot, the events of September 1980 would unleash a catastrophe that would define the lived experience of an entire generation. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. The war's brutality is nearly impossible to overstate here, with multiple uses of chemical weapons to murder civilians en masse. As the fighting raged on, Tehran initially felt distant from it all, tucked away in the mountains, far from the battlefields in the southwestern provinces. But as the war dragged on, it crept closer to the capital. Young men started disappearing from Tehran street, often drafted for the besieged militia. Black banners hung from balconies across the city to announce the loss of a relative, almost always a young man, and all too often below the age of 18. The true horror for Tehran didn't come until the so-called War of the Cities between 1985 and 1988. Saddam had grown frustrated with the relative stalemate on the ground and began to turn his missiles on Iran's cities, with Tehran as one of his priority targets. For 3 years, Scud missiles struck randomly, without any warning, hospitals, schools, bazaars. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of daily life, and families routinely slept fully clothed so as to be prepared for a midnight run to makeshift shelters. By its peak in 1988, the bombardment had become so intense that over 1 million people fled Tehran, nearly a third of the city's population, to the comparative safety of the countryside. Those who stayed reported feeling like sitting ducks, vulnerable to a missile strike at any moment. Tehran had become a ghost city. The deep psychological scars ran deep. An entire generation of Tehranis learned that their mountain fortress could be breached, that safety was an illusion, that death could fall from the sky at any moment. The end of the war brought a moment of genuine hope, and not just for Tehran. After nearly a decade of absolutely brutal fighting, the country was at peace. What's more was that Ayatollah Khomeini, the symbolic leader of the original Islamic revolution and supreme leader of the country ever since, was dead. His replacement, Khomeini, lacked the charisma and revolutionary credentials and was far less well known. Where the country was going was up in the air. Under Mayor Gholam Hossein Karbaski, the city underwent a comparative renaissance, given the traumas of the war years. Between 1991 and 1998, as Iranians began trickling back into the city, he more than doubled the number of parks from 75 to 180 and made serious strides on the long-promised metro system that had been planned since the Shah's time. The metro's opening shortly after he left office was particularly symbolic. Those orange trains running beneath Engelab Street represented the first major infrastructure project completed since the revolution. For a moment, it seemed that Tehran might just find its way back to some kind of normalcy. Two forces were well underway during those years that would lead the city to its current situation, though. A population boom and the imposition of increasingly suffocating international sanctions. The population statistics tell a story of urban catastrophe in slow motion. Tehran grew from 5 million people at the time of the revolution in 1979 to nearly double that in 2006. Today, the greater metropolitan area houses over 15 million, nearly 20% of Iran's entire population crammed into less than 1% of its land area. This wasn't organic urban growth either. Once the war was over, rural migrants, Afghan refugees, and provincial students all converged on Tehran, seeking opportunity or escape, swelling the city to its limits. Keep in mind, the city, rebuilt in the 1930s, was originally designed for 2 million. We're talking about being over the limit here by 7 times. Needless to say, the infrastructure couldn't exactly keep up with the demand. Water pipes bursting became an everyday occurrence, sewage backed up into the streets, and the electrical grid strained under loads it couldn't possibly carry. Traffic became so apocalyptic that the average commute stretched to 3 hours of breathing in exhaust from the cars in front of you just across the city. And then there was the international isolation. Having not exactly got it off on the right foot with the international community by kidnapping 52 American embassy staffers in the aftermath of the revolution, Iran found itself under immediate sanctions. But that was just the beginning. The 1995 oil embargo tightened the noose, with things only getting worse from there. For some context here, the currency collapse had been nothing short of spectacular. From 70 rials to the dollar before the revolution to around 10,000 by 2010 to over 500,000 today. Just think about that for a moment. If you saved the equivalent of $100,000 over your entire working life, it would be worth less than $20. But perhaps the most devastating consequence of Tehran's crisis isn't the economics or even the politics, it's the air itself. Tehran's geography, once its greatest strategic asset, has become its death trap. The city sprawls across the southern slopes of the Alborz Mountains at elevations between 1,100 and 1,700 meters, forming a natural bowl. The strategic location that once protected Tehran from invaders now serves primarily to trap pollution year-round. For 2/3 of the year, a dome of hot air sits over the metropolis, preventing pollutants from escaping upward. Winter's no better. Temperature inversions form where warm air above traps cooler air below, creating an impenetrable ceiling from which the exhaust from cars, along with industrial emissions, just can't break through. From the hills, you can see it. A dirty, grey-brown haze that sits over Tehran like a shroud. In 2012 alone, 4,460 Tehranis died from air pollution. That's more than 12 people every single day killed simply from breathing the air around them. Schools routinely closed throughout the city for smog days. Elderly residents with respiratory conditions, which have become increasingly common in recent years, become something akin to prisoners in their own apartments, and the wealthy flee to the mountains. Pollution regularly exceeds 200 and increasingly is above 300, deemed hazardous levels that make even a short walk outside a serious health risk. The pollution comes from everywhere. As many as 8 million vehicles, many of them decades old, burning low-quality gasoline with even lower-quality filters. It's just the start of the problem. Industrial zones burn fossil fuels daily, and when fuel shortages hit, power plants burn a lovely chemical called mazut, a heavy fuel oil so toxic that it's been banned in most countries. All of it gets trapped in Tehran's bowl, accumulating day after day until a strong wind or rain finally offers some temporary relief. Tehran's residents know exactly what's killing them, but they can't escape it. As one doctor at Imam Khomeini Hospital put it, "We see the same patients again and again. Children with asthma, elderly with COPD, young adults with unexplained respiratory problems. We treat them, send them home, and they breathe the same poison that brought them here." The city, to its credit, has tried various strategies to manage the situation, from odd-even license plate restrictions to relocating government offices. Nothing works. The geography is an insurmountable challenge. The population density is impossibly high for the infrastructure, and every winter, the death toll mounts. Tehran is literally choking on its success as Iran's megalopolis, a city that drew millions seeking opportunity. The pollution crisis might be manageable if the city's infrastructure still functioned, but Tehran's systems have been collapsing in dramatic fashion. First the power grid, then the water pumps. By summer of 2025, Tehran's infrastructure had entered terminal decline. The government did something unprecedented. It declared a public holiday just to reduce water consumption. The numbers tell the story of a city dying of thirst. The Karaj Dam, a crucial source of water for the city, hit its lowest level in 64 years by July 30th. The Amir Kabir Reservoir was down 58% year over year. La Dam sat at just 7% capacity. Tehran's water company, which had long denied rationing, finally urged residents to buy water tanks for their homes as insurance. Confirming what the residents had experienced far too long, the water shuts off all too frequently, sometimes for days at a time. Water cuts began hitting southern Tehran first, as of course the poorest part of the city. Taps ran dry for hours, then for days. By August, even affluent areas were experiencing what locals called silent rationing, pressure drops that leave upper floors dry, mysterious nighttime shutoffs that officials claim is maintenance. One resident of a 14th-floor apartment described the reality of when the elevator doesn't work during blackouts and the water won't reach them without electricity to run the pumps. They have to carry buckets up 14 floors. This is Tehran in 2025. The electricity crisis has a similarly compounding effect on just about everything. Iran faces a 20,000 megawatt shortfall for where it needs to be nationwide, but some cities with less population strain suffer less blackouts than its capital. When the power dies, so does everything else. Water pumps, elevators, traffic lights, air conditioners, even ATMs stop working. Businesses that can afford generators run them, but given the economic situation, that's a falling number with every passing year. The lack of air conditioning can be absolutely crippling. For our American audiences, we need to say little more than that, but even for those of you in Europe, Germany, wherever, trust us, this isn't heat you can get through the fan and an open window. During a heat wave in August, temperatures repeatedly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Holy shit, that's hot. Elderly people whose air conditioners died during blackouts were rushed to the hospital along with residents of high-rises whose residents couldn't ascend the dozens of flights of steps with heavy water canisters every day. One exhausted resident was quoted as saying, "Nothing works, no electricity, no water, no internet, no peace. This is already hell." Decades of sanctions, along with extensive corruption up and down the ranks of government, have left Tehran's infrastructure in that terminal decline we mentioned earlier. Power plants run at partial capacity for lack of parts. The electrical grid hasn't been properly upgraded since the 90s. Even government offices have been ordered to shut down elevators and air conditioning to save power. When the capital's own ministries can't keep the lights on, what hope is there for ordinary residents? Even in North Korea, where blackouts are infamous and life is incredibly difficult, their capital is widely viewed as the best place to be, not the worst. Now, if you were to ask ordinary Tehranis why their city is falling apart, sanctions would be their first answer, but corruption would be a close second. And here's the thing, while sanctions are imposed from the outside, corruption is a cancer that Tehran's own government has meticulously cultivated from within. Iran now ranks in the bottom 20% of countries in terms of corruption, according to Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, with a score of just 23 out of 100. That's worse than the Central African Republic. It's worse than Nigeria. It's truly approaching the territory of failed states. But these aren't abstract numbers. In Tehran, corruption has become the operating system of the city itself. The architecture starts at the top with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has transformed from a military force into Iran's largest business conglomerate. Through its construction arm, Qatam al-Anbiya, the guards control billions in no-bid contracts for everything from metro expansion to power plants. The US Treasury identified Qatar as the Guard's primary revenue engine as early as 2010, but that was just confirming what every Tehrani already knew. If you want to build anything significant in this city, you're paying the IRGC far more than what the work is worth. But perhaps nothing captures Tehran's corruption crisis quite like what happened at the Plasco building on January the 19th, 2017. This wasn't just any building, it was Tehran's first modern high-rise, built in 1962 as a symbol of the Shah's modernization. 17 stories that became an icon of the city's commercial heart. That Thursday morning, a fire broke out on the 9th floor. Within 3.5 hours, the entire structure had collapsed, killing 20 firefighters and injuring more than 200 people. The investigation revealed what everyone suspected: years of ignored safety violations and political connections that made the building untouchable despite repeated warnings. The building's owner allegedly had ties to Tehran's municipal government. Safety certificates were rubber-stamped despite failing basic fire codes. The very firefighters who died had complained for years about buildings like Plasco being death traps. The Plasco collapse was just the most visible symptom. Take the municipality property scandal that erupted in 2016 when investigative journalist Yashar Satani exposed how Tehran's then mayor Mohammad Bakir Ghalibaf, later Speaker of Parliament by the way, had orchestrated transfers of prime municipal land and luxury apartments to insiders at far sale prices. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in public assets simply handed over while ordinary Tehranis couldn't afford housing with basic amenities. The journalist who exposed it was detained. Ghalibaf? Well, he was promoted, wasn't he? The corruption has become so brazen that even regime insiders can't keep quiet. In 2022, leaked audio captured an IRGC commander discussing efforts to cover up embezzlement tied to Yas Holdings, another Guards-linked entity involved in Tehran municipality projects. Independent analysts estimate the exposure at $2.6 billion, siphoned from projects meant to improve the city's infrastructure. Every delayed metro line, every collapsed building, every neighborhood that floods during rainfall because the drainage money disappeared, all of it traces back to this systematic looting. For ordinary Tehranis, corruption is a tax on existence itself. Need a business permit? That requires bribes, the municipal officer, the safety inspector, and probably a third person to ensure that the paperwork actually moves. Your building failed inspection? Just slip the inspector enough cash that the red tag becomes green. But here's where corruption transforms from individual crime to systematic catastrophe, when you need to bribe your way around problems that corruption created in the first place. The metro doesn't run because construction funds were embezzled? Well, now you're stuck in traffic, burning fuel you can't afford, breathing pollution that shouldn't exist. The water system fails because maintenance money was stolen, and now you're buying rooftop tanks from companies owned by the same people who stole the maintenance funds. What makes Tehran's case particularly tragic is that corruption hasn't just stolen money, it's stolen competence. When contracts go to the connected rather than the capable, when every decision is filtered through who gets paid rather than what works, you create a city that literally cannot function. Dubai transformed from fishing village to global hub through relatively clean governance. Singapore built itself from little more than a swamp through ruthless anti-corruption enforcement. Seoul sits in a bowl just like Tehran but breathes freely because its government prioritized public service over private profit. The current mayor, Alireza Zakani, took office in 2021, promising to clean up corruption. By 2024, the city council had opened inquiries into hundreds of millions in missing funds from his administration. The cycle continues, each iteration making the city less livable while those in power grow wealthier from its decay. Tehran's tragedy is that its corruption has become too profitable to cure. The IRGC's empire depends on those no-bid contracts. The municipality's power brokers need their property schemes. The police require their daily bribes to supplement worthless wages. Everyone with the power to fix the system profits from its dysfunction, while everyone suffering lacks the power to change anything. It is the perfect parasite, one that has evolved to keep its host just barely alive enough to continue feeding on, but never healthy enough to throw it off. If the residents of Tehran thought their situation couldn't get any worse, well, June 2025 proved them oh so wrong. Between June the 13th and the 24th, Israel achieved complete air superiority over Tehran, along with numerous other Iranian cities, that revealed just how vulnerable the country was. Yet while other cities were impacted by this, Tehran felt it the hardest. Israel wasn't just looking to hit strategic targets, they wanted to send the message that they could hit anywhere in the country at any time. The moment that crystallized the regime's impotence for residents across the country came on June 16th, when the IRIB headquarters was bombed during a live broadcast. Countless Iranian citizens watched as the state television building, which was putting out 24/7 propaganda about how minor Israel strikes were, shook and debris fell all around, and the anchor fled mid-sentence as it appeared the building could give in at any second. The transmission cut to black for 2 hours, but when it was eventually restored, the message was clear. The government couldn't even protect its own propaganda machine. Then came June the 23rd and the bombing of Evin prison. Multiple impacts across the complex killed as many as 80 people, prisoners and guards alike. Much of it was blown open from above. Some inmates escaped in the chaos, others died in their cells. North Tehran residents reported seeing smoke rising from the complex as roads were sealed and sirens wailed for hours. What made these days particularly surreal was how the regime's priorities shifted seemingly overnight. The dreaded morality police, who had made women's lives hell for decades, all but vanished from Tehran's streets, allowing women to walk freely throughout the capital without headscarves in a brief, bizarre moment of freedom and terror. This had caused yet another exodus from the city. Reuters documented thousands fleeing the capital, particularly from eastern districts closest to military targets. Those who stayed learned to sleep in corridors away from windows, using metro stations as improvised bomb shelters. Families divided cash among relatives in case banks collapsed. They filled bathtubs while water still flowed, and waited through information blackouts that lasted hours while explosions echoed across the city. By the time the ceasefire took hold on June the 26th, something fundamental had broken in Tehran specifically. While the regime had made 21,000 arrests nationwide, in Tehran the crackdown felt different. It felt hollow and desperate. The city that housed the regime's power centers had been exposed as defenseless. Evin prison, IRIB headquarters, even several IRGC commanders' homes were all hit with impunity. Tehran's tragedy isn't written into its mountains or encoded into its DNA. While geography absolutely plays a role in shaping the fate of a city or even a country, places with far worse geographic positions have thrived. Singapore built itself from a swamp into a global hub. Dubai transformed itself from a tent city less than a century ago into a glittering metropolis. Even Seoul sits in a bowl like Tehran, but everyone breathes fine. And the difference is governance. Tehran's mountains were once an asset, and they could be again. Just think, ski resorts an hour from downtown and protection from desert storms. The altitude that traps pollution could have been managed with emission standards, functional public transit, and proper industrial planning. Other mountain cities have turned their geography into actual advantages. Switzerland's Alps, Colorado's Rockies, Chile's Andes are assets that draw tourists from all around the world. What Tehran teaches us is that cities fail not because of where they're built, but because of how they're run. When you combine decades of economic isolation along with both widespread corruption and overpopulation, this is what you get. If the city's history teaches us anything, it's that this city has survived the unimaginable before. The question now isn't whether Tehran can be fixed, it's whether anyone with the power to do so actually wants to. Thank you for watching.